Hi, everyone. I am Emily Berman. I am here at Defending Rights in Dissent, and I am a professor at University of Houston Law Center, longtime board member at Defending Rights in Dissent. So last month, FBI agents carried out a morning raid at the personal home of Washington Post reporter Hannah Natanson, who covers the Trump White House and who won the Pulitzer Prize as part of the team covering January 6th in 2022. She was not the target of the investigation. The search warrant indicates that it is an Espionage Act investigation into her alleged source or sources. During the raid, agents seized both her personal and work phones and computers, cutting off her access to thousands of contacts and sources, and presumably putting that information in the hands of federal investigators. So Defending Rights in Dissent has convened this panel of experts to talk about the raid, what it means for press freedom, and efforts to reform the law behind it. Kevin Gosztola is an independent journalist who writes at thecenter.org, who has long covered Espionage Act abuses and other attacks on journalists and their First Amendment rights. Kevin wrote about the Natanson raid at the Dissenter. Check that out. Chip Gibbons is the policy director here at Defending Rights in Dissent and the author of a critical history of the FBI called The Imperial Bureau, coming soon to a bookstore near you from Verso. Chip has advised members of Congress on reforming the Espionage Act and reported on numerous Espionage Act prosecutions. Along with Seth Stern, Chip wrote about the Natanson raid in The Guardian. And finally, Jeffrey Sterling, my fellow board member at Defending Rights in Dissent, a former CIA officer who served more than 2 years in prison after he himself was falsely convicted under the Espionage Act in 2015. So, Kevin, why don't we start with you? And can you just talk about the raid on Hannah Natanson itself? What happened, what the government is alleging, what does it mean in practical terms for her reporting? What does it mean in broader terms for other reporters with government sources in Washington? What are sort of the on-the-ground implications here?
Yeah, so just to outline, in the middle of January, we had this raid take place, which I think it's fair to say was possibly the most extraordinary attack on freedom of the press during President Donald Trump's second term. It's not like there haven't been assaults on press freedom and that we haven't seen systematic undermining of the First Amendment. But this represented, I think, something the Trump administration had always intended to do when it was campaigning, when Trump was campaigning for re-election and had generated this Project 2025 and discussed openly how he was going to further delegitimize media organizations, particularly those that had originally been doing investigations or accountability journalism on his administration during his first term. And so we saw FBI agents use as a pretext this Espionage Act prosecution against Aurelio Perez Lagones, and using the backdrop of what was happening with the military operation that ended up with the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuela president, bringing him back to New York for a trial. He's basically using this as the reason why they needed to go into the home of Hannah Natanson, and they seized multiple electronics from her. There's a personal laptop. There's a work laptop that is owned by the Washington Post. There is her own personal iPhone. There is a voice recorder that they took, and there's also a Garmin running watch, which so far no one from the government has provided any reasoning why they would need to take her running watch. But they took all of these electronics, and until there was a standstill order issued by a court, this warrant that was authorized, these warrants that were authorized for searching Hannah Natanson's electronics. They could search her person. They could go into her home. This was something that was entirely in effect until these press freedom organizations, the outcry around the First Amendment happened. And then right now, they're not searching those electronics, but there's an effort to try and get them returned to Hannah Natanson. And what we know from a declaration that she entered into court is that she lost access to somewhere around 1,000 to 1,200 sources that she was working with. And we know she was open about those sources and how she communicated with them via the Signal messaging app, something that's become a very useful tool for journalists to use in the last 10 to 15 years, and that she no longer has access to any of those contacts. She hasn't been able to work on any stories. And so she lost that way of covering the impact of Donald Trump's administration on the federal employees, on federal employees, on federal contractors. And this is something that she had been helping to do for the Washington Post. And that was the role she had played. And so now she has to sit entirely on the sidelines and she can't do this work. As you said, she wasn't targeted in the sense that she wasn't arrested because she had this material. But what it does say in the search warrant is that they're going there to seize these electronics because they have fruits of the crime. And so they are taking this material, this work product from her. And they even got in the warrant something where they could force her to unlock anything that was biometrically locked. So they could take her fingerprints and put it on the device if they needed to get into it. Fortunately, she wasn't using that for any of her devices, but she didn't realize, according to her, that her Washington Post laptop was enabled with this. And so they were able to get into that. But I understand that they've only been able to partially review the work laptop. So we don't really know what has been compromised, but what is clear, and I can end on this point, is that none of those people who contacted Hannah Natanson want to be in contact with her right now, want to be contacting people who are working for the government. All those sources have dried up. It's probably fair to say that there's a level of journalism that is going to be non-existent for the Post for just a while because they know that the Trump administration had taken this action. So as far as sources go, I don't think they would probably want to reach out to the Washington Post at this time, leaving aside the fact that there is a real economic pressure in the layoffs that we saw recently that I think just probably compounds the kind of general repression that it seems is ongoing here when you talk about what happened with the FBI raid against Hannah Natanson.
Emily, you're muted.
Thanks for that background. I think one sort of additional note that we should keep in mind as we talk about this administration and what it might be up to here is that in the previous administration, they had really tightened down the rules on when investigators were able to search journalists, whether it's their emails or their devices, going after their sources, and had really imposed a policy that recognized the importance and the value of investigative journalism in holding the government to account. And when the Trump administration came in, they just wiped away that new policy. And so we're seeing, I think, the results of that shift here in very stark terms. Chip, let's turn to you. The search warrant in this case shows that agents are investigating what they identify as a potential violation of the Espionage Act. So tell us what the Espionage Act is and how it might relate to this particular case.
Sure. So the Espionage Act is one of the worst laws passed in U.S. history. Although its name sounds like it deals with spies and saboteurs, it has been one of the worst laws for press freedom or just freedom of expression generally in the U.S. It was passed during World War I, and initially the targets of the law were not spies or saboteurs, but Americans who had expressed opposition to the war. People would say things like Woodrow Wilson is a Wall Street tool. the master class starts the wars, the servant class fights them. Pretty standard examples of free speech, and they would be convicted under the Espionage Act. These convictions were sort of achieved in two different ways. One of which was they would sort of use this expansive series of theory of liability that provisions dealing with insubordination in the military or obstruction of conscription by saying anti-war statements, you would incite insubordination in the military, or you would, obstruct conscription. This is very similar to the types of arguments we hear the Trump administration making right now about the left is responsible for Charlie Kirk being killed, or that the individuals who are the members of Congress who gave the statement of law about lawful orders are somehow guilty for insubordination. They're not new arguments. They weren't new arguments when they were brought in during World War I. They go all the way back to how slave owners tried to suppress abolitionist literature. Additionally, there was a 1918 amendment which made it a crime to use abusive, profane, or scurrilous language about the U.S. government or its flag. That was later repealed, but a lot of some 2,000 people were prosecuted under this version of the Espionage Act. Beginning with Daniel Ellsberg, the law comes into a second use, and there's earlier cases, but I'm going to be truncated here, which is that it's used to both prosecute whistleblowers who bring information about the U.S. government crimes to the public, as well as to try to prevent the New York Times from publishing the information. Many people think the Pentagon Papers case resolved the question of whether a publisher can be prosecuted for publishing national defense information. But in fact, the Supreme Court was silent on that issue. They only dealt with what was needed for the government to receive prior restraint, that is blocking publication. They were silent on when you can be prosecuted after the fact. And the Espionage Act provision we're dealing with right here at 793, it covers obtaining national defense information, which if a journalist gets a state secret, they've done, copying national defense information, having lawful possession of national defense information and communicating it to someone not entitled to receive it. That's what the whistleblower would do potentially. Having unauthorized possession and communicating to someone not entitled to receive it, or willfully retaining it, which is what a journalist does when they report on the abuses of the government, right? If I learn from Edward Snowden that there's a secret surveillance system that violates the Constitution, and I put that in The Guardian, I don't have lawful possession of information, and I just communicated it to someone not entitled to receive it. And this provision is actually extraordinarily dangerous because the U.S. government has argued in courts, not during a prosecution of an individual for doing this, but just as a general, this is what we think, that if you share a New York Times article on social media that contains classified information, you have broken the Espionage Act. And as a funny and sad story, when I was in law school, I was in a class and another student was an intern at the NSA, and the professor started talking about a story in the Washington Post about a CIA covert action. And she raised her hand, yelled, "Professor, professor, professor, just because it's in the newspaper doesn't mean it's not still classified," like chastising the professor. But this is a huge part of the problem with sections of the Espionage Act. It doesn't define national defense information. We know from OLC memos they consider all classified information to be national defense information. It's unclear if they consider non-classified information to be national defense information. The Espionage Act predates classification, and it is limitless in its liability. It doesn't just apply to a government employee who has a duty to protect class information. It could apply to anyone. So the journalist who receives it, the person who reads the newspaper and says, "Hey, Emily, did you see that story about the Nord Stream pipeline today?" Right? I'm then breaking the Espionage Act in theory. So it's a really limitless law that criminalizes a broad amount of speech. And, it's very, very frightening. In this case, what's disturbing is that we are once again seeing a government insider being prosecuted for acting as a journalist source. Acting as a source to a journalist is not treason. It's not espionage. It's not sabotage. It is many times patriotic and heroic. And of course, we know leak investigations are inherently political, because if you leak information that benefits the government, you aren't prosecuted. And a Senate study into classification in the 90s conceded that the largest leaker of secrets in Washington is the U.S. government itself, because it engages in these sort of psychological operations and media manipulation, where they feed people in the media information and then, parrot it. So it's only applied to those who are critical of government policy. And it isn't just limited to government insiders. It applies to everyone. In this case, what we see is it's being used to prosecute a government insider, but they're using it to gain access to a journalist's communications who is not under criminal investigation. And while the Espionage Act in the Assange case was used to prosecute a journalist, even when you don't prosecute the journalist, it opens the journalist up to surveillance as they try to prove this person was the source. And one point I will close on, because the unauthorized disclosure of national defense information is governed by the Espionage Act, the body within the FBI who has responsibility for enforcing it is the counterintelligence division or section within the National Security Division, which I always conflate divisions and sections within the FBI. I can never remember which one is which. I apologize in advance. And that's really troubling, because the FBI is a hybrid agency. It's both a law enforcement agency and an intelligence national security agency. And in law enforcement, there are greater constitutional protections than there are in intelligence. So now you have journalists under the purview of the FBI and within the section where there are the least amount of constitutional rights, all thanks to this unconstitutional law that needs to go. Emily, I fear you're muted again.
Sorry about that. I think Jeffrey Sterling would agree with you that the law has to go. Here we have a raid, Jeffrey, on a journalist to obtain information on an alleged source. As Chip said, this sadly is not a new use of the law. And in fact, the government falsely accused you of being a source for former New York Times reporter James Risen. Can you tell us about your experience dealing with the Espionage Act and what role the surveillance of Risen as a journalist played in its case against you?
I think Chip described it eloquently. It's an indefensible law. When I went to law school, I learned that laws that you could not defend yourself against were, contrary to equal protection under the law. Well, there I was in trial going up against this Espionage Act. It's what I like to call a we say so law. And all the government has to do is say, this person violated the Espionage Act, and then they can do whatever they want. They can prosecute in whatever way that they want. They don't have to come up with any harm, any damages as a result of the so-called leak or disclosure of information. All they have to do is say they violated the Espionage Act. They don't have to really defend any classification. They control any evidence that's brought forward, and they can do whatever they want. And courts have been all too willing to bow down once a prosecution says Espionage Act violation. That's it. The courts will step aside and let them railroad over defendants. That's what I felt like in my trial. But yet I still, it's like I was not going to myself bow down to these false charges, but I was going to fight. And with regard to the reporter, throughout, I even had to wonder, what was this all about? All of the actions, all of the motions taken by the government were directed at the reporter. Well, they were so boastful about the financial and travel records that they seized on the reporter. And of course, none of which, of course, tied him to me. They didn't even enter them into evidence. But it seemed like it was this vendetta to get at this reporter. And I felt like a spectator at times of my own trial. It was the U.S. versus the reporter as opposed to U.S. versus Sterling. And and then they had won the opportunity to call the reporter, yet they did not. So, I was wondering, what was this all about? It was character assassination, which is easy to do under the Espionage Act. And it's all about what the government says someone did wrong. And what it really turned into, I believe, that trial of mine, it was nothing more than a show trial. The government doesn't have to do anything. That all they have to do is say, this person did this act. And it was nothing more than a show trial. The government needed no proof and didn't even pretend to have any proof of guilt. So, it's just this elaborate scheme of revenge, if you will. And I think that's how the Espionage Act has been used. And I think particularly against reporters. I think my trial clearly demonstrated that. And it seems like this administration has taken it to levels, far beyond, I think, what anyone expected or wanted out of this act.
Yeah, so I think we've seen a lot of evidence of the Espionage Act being used exactly as you described, Jeffrey, as sort of a revenge against either whistleblowers who the government doesn't like what they have to say, or against reporters who bring their stories to the public. And I suspect that a lot of it has to do with, making a show of this is what's going to happen to you, and chilling both potential whistleblowers as well as the people who are going to use that information. Now, usually the government focuses on the leaker and not the leakee. But Kevin and Chip, you both have reported on the Espionage Act. And in recent pieces on the raid on Hannah Natanson, you've both invoked the government's prosecution of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, which is sort of the one time that the government has convicted someone who was a recipient of government information rather than the leaker. So tell us what Assange was ultimately convicted of, and whether that conviction has implications for this case.
Yeah, I'll start it. I'll let Kevin fill in. I know I will leave some details out that Kevin will correct me on, of course. So Assange ultimately pled guilty under the conspiracy provision of the Espionage Act. And what the plea deal alleges was that Assange conspired with his source, Chelsea Manning. And the elements of the conspiracy was that Chelsea Manning obtained the information she wasn't supposed to. She gave it to Julian Assange. He wasn't supposed to. Julian received it. He wasn't supposed to. He published it. He wasn't supposed to. Now, that's called a journalist-source relationship. And what the Julian Assange plea deal did was it criminalized the journalist-source relationship as sort of a conspiracy. And it's worth going back to the Bush era, when there's the only other prosecution of non-government insiders. They weren't terribly sympathetic. They were AIPAC lobbyists, but it also engaged in this sort of conspiracy theory or aiding and abetting liability. And in the Assange indictment, 3 of the charges are the pure publishing charges, which are extremely disturbing and were very new. They said that basically by putting documents on the internet, WikiLeaks Assange broke the Espionage Act. But the bulk of the indictment was aiding and abetting or conspiracy liability, that Chelsea Manning gave Assange the documents and he was responsible for aiding and abetting her and conspiring with her. So there was this intent to sort of take the actions of the source and impart liability on them for the publisher through conspiracy theories, through like legal conspiracy theories, but also in the case of what actually probably happened between Manning and Assange, like conspiracy theories in a colloquial sense, as well as aiding and abetting liability. And this is extremely troubling. I sat in the London courtroom a couple times during the extradition, and what I was hearing was that the position of the extraditing counsel, the counsel wants to see Julian Assange extradited to the US, was that because WikiLeaks announced it would publish secrets, if somebody in the future obtained secrets and gave them to them, either in violation of the Espionage Act or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which we're not going to talk much about today, but that was also there, that they were in a conspiracy with those unknown people. And in the final indictment, they did 3 indictments against Julian Assange. In the final indictment, elements of the conspiracy included such ridiculous tasks as Julian Assange went on Democracy Now! And praised Edward Snowden. And they claimed this was done to incite future people to do what Snowden had done. He was recruiting systems analysis. That didn't get a lot of attention, even in the press freedom community. Having been on Democracy Now! And praised Edward Snowden, I was very concerned by that passage. But the Assange prosecution, it isn't just the first prosecution of a journalist or a publisher. I consider Julian Assange to be a journalist. I know some of our friends in the press freedom community aren't as enlightened on that issue as I am, but it also criminalized the journalist-source relationship, and it made it possible to say that a journalist can conspire with their source or aid and abet their source. So the Trump administration hasn't done that yet. I don't want to talk too much about that because I want to give them ideas, but we should be really concerned when they are gathering a journalist information about all of their sources. And in this case, the reporter was open. She had many sources that under the Biden administration, they were able to ratify this theory that a journalist-source relationship can constitute a conspiracy under the Espionage Act.
Well, I'll just jump in and add some of the background here that this isn't a case that is well known, but there is an Espionage Act case against Stephen Kim, who was a State Department employee. And this is something that, in fact, in bad faith, FBI Director Kash Patel invoked on a conservative news, on an internet conservative news channel. But he invoked the fact that Obama had prosecuted more sources than all previous presidents combined through the Espionage Act, and basically was suggesting that all of us who are objecting to the FBI's conduct today would be hypocrites. The only problem for Kash Patel is that we are actually principled people, and everybody here on this program has been critical and challenging the way that the Espionage Act is used against media sources for some time. So we don't just only object to Donald Trump's use of it in his Justice Department. We also object to how Obama's Justice Department used it as well. And in this case, it was Fox News reporter James Rosen who was singled out. And we've talked about work product materials that the FBI has been able to access, or that they would like to, I think, access on those electronics if the court would allow them, so that they can sift through and figure out what classified information she's been able to obtain. And I think, incidentally, we have to imagine they could find information that didn't just come from Aurelio Perez Lagones, but it could come from other sources that they could then work backwards and go find those individuals and maybe make further Espionage Act cases out of that as well. But in the James Rosen case, I have this in front of me. It was very clear that they said that the FBI had the authority to search media-related work product materials, even when possessed by a national news reporter, because there's probable cause to believe that the person possessing such materials has committed or was committing a criminal offense. It's something that you see in these cases also. Moving on from the Rosen case, or the case of labeling him, he was actually labeled an aider, abettor, and co-conspirator of a crime of violating the Espionage Act, along with Stephen Kim. What you find also is that as privacy tools have been adopted and more people use them, those are being put into the indictments as part of the evidence of being a co-conspirator as the reporter. So the fact that Hannah Natanson is using this communication tool of the Signal messaging app, that's something that gets treated as if it's a reason why she can't be trusted and why they need to go after her and not just give her a subpoena. You know, there's evidence that or claims that are being put forward by the FBI where they're saying that Hannah Natanson misled investigators about the security of her devices, or like not really telling them the truth about whether she had enabled Touch ID or not on them. Again, just fabricating these pretexts to get into her electronics, but also, you have to try and discredit the reporter if you're the government every step of the way. And to bring it to Assange, what you find in the indictment against him, the accusations were that Assange was encouraging Chelsea Manning to provide this information. Similarly, you see in the affidavit for this case that Natanson is accused of soliciting information when she asks Perez Lagones if there was any way to get more detail on the government agency report and country one safely. That would be a top priority for us. Country one was Venezuela. They also made contentions, the prosecutors did, about Assange, that he had knowledge that Manning was providing WikiLeaks, that she was providing WikiLeaks with classified records. And so that is also something that they put in the indictment or in the search warrant application against Hannah Natanson, this saying that the reporter knows that the source is giving them classified information. I'll end on this point. What we've seen, not just now, but over the last 6 months, is injecting this idea into the wider political conversation that if a reporter knows that they are getting information that is classified, they have some sort of an obligation to return it to these agencies, because it is criminal for them to have that information in the eyes of Trump administration officials. And so that has been a fundamental element of the friction, the walkout, the reporters that left the Pentagon who are no longer stationed there, who can't do their work there. They fought the restrictions because they were basically told that there were certain things that if they ever got this kind of information from sources in the Pentagon, it would represent a national security threat. They would not have a First Amendment right to keep this information. And so all along for the last, year of the Trump administration, they've been slowly, gradually building this up, even though it's kind of been inherent. It's sort of existed, if you look closely at these cases going back to the early days of the Obama administration, this idea that if reporters do possess the information, and I think you can probably even go back to the stories that were published in the New York Times around warrantless wiretapping and what the Bush administration or Dick Cheney would have said about all of this, that just the mere fact that the reporters possess this information is something that gets treated as a national security threat. And they have now come up with, in the Trump Justice Department, this tactic of, well, if we think you have it on your electronic devices, we will go try to get a search warrant and take it back from you so that we can be sure that there's not going to be anything done with it further after the fact. And then in the meantime, by doing that, they're going to create this huge, massive web of, there'll be this intimidation of all the sources that you ever communicated with as a reporter. You're basically going to be burned as a credible reporter who can go around and talk to insiders in the government. And I think that's an intention. I think that it's fair, based on the zealousness of the Trump administration and the way they talk about these people in the media and the way they are very open about intimidating and trying to harass people who are publishing leaks, that this is what they want. And we've seen this with how there's Representative Luna, who is talking about how she wants an Espionage Act up and has referred it to the Justice Department to prosecute him for simply just describing who he thinks has ties or links to a Venezuela military operation by referencing a public online profile of a Delta Force officer, a high-ranking Delta Force officer. And then you saw in this past week that the Customs and Border Protection fired someone who was working there that they allege leaked. And then there's a calling out and a harassment of reporters who are publishing leaks and basically saying that we are going to come for your sources. And then obviously, if the government is coming for your sources, it makes it really hard for you to push forward and exercise your First Amendment right to engage in journalism.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm going to come back to you quickly. There's another aspect of this Natanson case that you have written about that I think is an important element to get on the table. So tell us, who is Gordon Kromberg and why do we care about him?
Yeah, so this is something that has a commonality with the Assange case, because Gordon Kromberg himself is the assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia right now. He's been around for, I think, 20 plus years. He's been in government working in some role as a federal prosecutor. He was on the, he was implicated in some abuses with the Samuel Arian case, which is separate from the issues we're dealing with today. But I just want to mention the context of, he's been associated with Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism in the Justice Department. He is also the person who put forward the idea in the Assange case that I think, based on the evidence that we have before us and the reporting that the Washington Post actually did to dig into how we arrived at an Assange plea deal, that his assertion that the U.S. government could go in and argue that as a foreign national, Julian Assange did not have First Amendment rights to challenge his prosecution under the Espionage Act, that, and I might be sort of oversimplifying that, but that was generally what was articulated in these representations that were made to the British courts. And by doing that, it really frightened or unnerved the High Court of Justice that was hearing the appeal from Assange. And they thought there was a chance that this meant that British citizens, or just people who are from the Europe in general or other parts of the world, could be extradited and treated differently from U.S. citizens, which would allow for some discrimination in the process, would suggest that you're not actually going to be given the due process and fair justice that you are owed. And ultimately, I'm not sure that the Justice Department knew how to overcome this statement that Gordon Kromberg had put forward. And so now he's on this case. He's the one that signs off on the search warrant application. I was writing about him because our friends and colleagues over at the Freedom of the Press Foundation have asked the Virginia State Bar to look into what he did, because he is authorizing an illegal newsroom raid, or he's authorizing that you could go into the home of a reporter and seize the work product that they have on their electronics, and that should be a violation of the First Amendment. He didn't say anything to the judge when he was asking for a warrant for those warrants. He didn't mention the Privacy Protection Act. I'm not as much of an expert on that law as I probably should be, given all the work that I've done on the Espionage Act and leaks and classified information in these First Amendment cases. But my basic understanding of it is that it is supposed to give you some sort of modest protection from what they would do. And I think it is ultimately why what you said at the beginning here, Emily, of there was this understanding established. We had these news media guidelines. They were developed under Eric Holder. They were further reinforced by Merrick Garland after there was outrage about subpoenas that the Trump administration sought against CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And that was towards the tail end of Donald Trump's first term. And it basically said that they were not going to use intrusive means to get at the information to investigate leaks. They were going to use subpoenas, or they would go to court. They would tell the judge why they needed to get at this material. There would hopefully be a chance for a reporter to contest the fact that the government was coming after this information. And there's, the position of Donald Trump's administration is that no reporters are to be trusted. They cannot work with the government. The hostility is something that is actually kind of shocking when you think of the access journalism and how many of these national security correspondents, whether they're at the Pentagon or they're in the realm of national security, and they go into these halls and they socialize and they know all of these people. And then now all of those leaders that are at those institutions in which they had formed these working relationships, all of them are basically saying, no matter how much you've shown that you would be responsible, no matter how you bent over backwards, no matter how you withheld certain information. I mean, the Washington Post and the New York Times, I think, knew that this military operation was going to take place in Venezuela back in January, and they sat on it until it had been carried out. They knew it at least between 6 and 12 hours before it happened, if not longer. And that doesn't get them anything. They still are being targeted and repressed by Donald Trump's administration.
Yeah. Chip, I think you had something to add about our friend, Mr. Kronberg.
Yeah, Gordon Kronberg is quite a loathsome character, and he has been criticized for a very long time, going back to his sort of prosecution of Muslim American activists. And I'm very glad Freedom of the Press Foundation filed the bar complaint with him. A few years ago, I went to the House Judiciary. I shouldn't admit this. I might be on Mr. Kronberg's radar now. I went to someone with the House Judiciary Committee and was talking about all the things Kronberg was doing. And they just cut me off and said, we know all about Gordon Kronberg, right? They knew and did nothing about him. So it's way past time for him to be held accountable. He has a lot of very extreme views in his personal life, which he's entitled to. But just for context, he's published personal writings that refer to the occupied Palestinian West Bank as Judea and Samar. That's the term the extreme sort of people believe in Greater Israel use, which makes it very disturbing. He's also saying things like, why can't Muslims testify before a grand jury during Ramadan? They can kill each other during Ramadan or kill people in Ramadan. He was the prosecutor in both the Julian Assange and the Daniel Hale case. During the Hale case, he compared Daniel Hale, was a wonderful human being, a very patriotic whistleblower, to a heroin dealer, which was one of the most disgusting things I've just ever sat through in a court. He also jumped up and down at one point and told the judge he had just said class information, and we found out later he had retroactively classified it. But Kronberg really overstepped in the Assange case and basically tanked the case. Kevin went into these details, but during the extradition hearings, a friend of mine, a friend of Defending Rights and Dissents, a friend of Jeffrey, a friend of Kevin's, Kerry Shankman, was called to testify about the U.S. Espionage Act, and he listed all of the constitutional problems with it. And Gordon Kronberg filed an affidavit in which he said Mr. Assange could raise those issues during a preliminary hearing, which is all he had to say. And then he started saying how he thought the government would respond to those various claims, which never do that. I don't know why a lawyer would do that. And, as Kevin alluded to, one of the things he said was that the U.S. government might argue that as a foreign national, Julian Assange has no First Amendment rights, at least in respect to national defense information. And this violated all kinds of treaties about discriminating on the basis of nationality. And it was my suspicion that the British judges were prepared to rubber stamp the extradition before he said this. And they asked him just to give an assurance that he wouldn't basically raise his argument, and he refused to do that. And instead, they drilled down on this bonkers argument that instead of discriminating against Julian Assange on the basis of nationality, they were going to discriminate against him on the basis of citizenship. And the British judges did not have any clue what they were talking about. And I believe in some of the reporting from, I forget if it was Washington Post, New York Times, the British counsel basically told the U.S. they weren't going with this case because it was unethical. So Gordon Kronberg is a very inflammatory person. A lot of people have questioned why he's allowed to handle sensitive cases, because he says these bombastic things that could sink them. And there's a very strong argument that his arrogance, thankfully, I guess, sunk the extradition of Julian Assange and resulted in the plea deal. After that, you would think Kronberg would be sidelined. And my understanding from reporters who cover the Department of Justice, that he was not a popular figure there, and he has sort of reemerged again. And I think the fact that he is, because he wasn't on a number of subsequent Espionage Act prosecutions, he wasn't on the Ashif Rahman prosecution. It seemed very clear to me that he had potentially been sidelined. And he's back. And I think it speaks to the fact that he is one of the people who would be willing to sign off on the raid of a Washington Post reporter's house. There's all this attention given to these creepy people in the Trump administration who aren't qualified for their jobs, who are pushing all kinds of things before grand juries that shouldn't be going there. And that's true. That Trump administration has brought in Trump loyalists over career prosecutors who are doing unethical things, but there are also people lurking in the national security state across bipartisan administrations who also want to do these unethical, unconstitutional things and are giving license to do so by Trump or are eager to help and assist Mr. Trump.
Yeah, it's been a little disheartening to see just how many people there are that are willing to do some of the things that have been asked of them. So Jeffrey, this raid has been cited as an example of President Trump's authoritarianism or hostility to the press, and that's undeniably true, that this is sort of part and parcel of his leadership style. But your own prosecution, as was mentioned earlier, actually took place under the Obama administration. So, as we said, this is not necessarily a Trump-only concern or even a Republican-only concern. So how do you think that past Espionage Act prosecutions like yours have enabled or provided the building blocks for the current sort of escalating hostility to press freedom that we seem to be seeing now?
Yeah, I think the actions of the Obama administration, prosecuting whistleblower after whistleblower, opened the door. One thing to understand about even my prosecution, the previous administration had dropped any investigation into me with regard to any supposed leak because there was no evidence. The Obama administration comes in and revives a dead case using the Espionage Act. And I think that shows the power of the Espionage Act. You don't even need evidence. You just need a prosecution. And that's exactly what happened with me. And one thing in my trial that maybe was overlooked, but there was an appeal because the judge had ruled that the government could not call the reporter, could not ask the question, who's your source, ask about the sources or anything like that. There was an interlocutory appeal and the government won. They had the power because up to that point, it had been an open question as to whether the government could call a reporter or jail them for not answering questions about their sources. And there's maybe a gentleman's agreement between the administration and the press that they wouldn't go after individuals who had reported on things related to supposedly national security. They won that open question was finally answered in that appeal. That appeal allowed the government to say, nope, all gloves are off. Reporters are subject to the same prosecution as a leaker or whistleblower. But even with that victory during my trial, the government decided not to call the reporter. It's like you go through all this, you have the right to call it, but I think the Obama administration didn't want to be that administration that jailed a reporter. Because he was saying throughout that he would rather go to jail than testify about his sources. So I think that set the stage, certainly, and the Trump administration has taken that stage and made an opera out of it. They've gone as far as, well, we see with the raid on the reporter's home, that they have there's nothing that's going to hold them back in going after a reporter. And one thing that, with regard to Kronberg, I think he's an epitome of the Espionage Act. You have so many individuals who have questionable legal ethics or general ethics who are driving these prosecutions, which essentially turn out to be persecutions. And they are the face of the Espionage Act, of its broad use. And as someone who was prosecuted under the Espionage Act and others who have been charged with violating the Espionage Act, it is tragically ironic that Donald Trump, who himself was indicted on violating the Espionage Act, is in the administration, leading these charges. In the current way that the Espionage Act is being used, Donald Trump is the poster child for its use. Yet he controls the DOJ now, and it's even more so a tool of going after whistleblowers. It is now his tool it's his vendetta tool. So I think all of this shows how this overbroad law is not in the interest of this country. It's not in the interest of national security. It's in the self-preservation interest of those in power.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. Is it doesn't matter who's in power. None of them wants their secrets to be exposed. And I think it is important to note that the Obama administration prosecuted more leakers than all of the previous administrations that had come before him combined. And so I do think that's really where this got normalized as a tool for yes, punishing people who engage in espionage, but also intimidating people who share or publish information that the executive branch would rather not have in the public sphere. So given all that we've talked about and the clear problems that this sort of overbroad and outdated law has led to, Chip, tell us what can be done to reform the Espionage Act. What do we need to do?
Well, Representative Rashida Tlaib has on several occasions submitted amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act that outline the Defending Rights and Dissent program for reforming the Espionage Act. They won the support of Jeffrey Sterling, of Tom Drake. They're the only, another whistleblower, they're the only proposal I know of that has won the support of Daniel Ellsberg, who is unfortunately no longer with us. And Representative Tlaib will be introducing that proposal as a standalone bill, the Daniel Ellsberg Press Freedom and Whistleblower Protection Act. It is named in honor of Dan, as he was very supportive and very helpful to those efforts. I was very honored and privileged to get to work with Dan to bring us to this point. I wish he was still with us to see it get to the floor, but he isn't, which is a very big loss for all of us. But what the Tlaib amendment does, or Tlaib proposal does, it touches two provisions of the Espionage Act, 793, the one we've talked about, 798, which is similar to 793, but was passed in 1950 based off of the bizarre belief that the NSA was not protected by the Espionage Act. They were. We just gave prosecutors a way to use charge stacking against NSA whistleblowers. But what it does is it restricts the use of these provisions to government employees with a duty to protect classified information, or in some cases, foreign agents, thus preventing its use against journalists, publishers, and members of the general public. Remember, the government claims if you share a New York Times article with class information on Twitter, you violate the Espionage Act. It requires the national defense information to be properly classified. Section 793 does not mention classification. It predates it. Section 798 does, but courts have ruled in, I believe, both cases, the government can wrongfully classify the information. You're not supposed to class information to protect abuses of power, waste, fraud, and abuse. But the courts have said, it doesn't matter because courts can't decide whether or not something is properly classified, and it doesn't have to be properly classified to be prosecuted for releasing it just classified. And it also requires the government to prove the defendant acted with the specific intent to injure the United States or aid a foreign power, i.e. committed actual espionage. In a court filing a few years ago, the government conceded that in all of the media leak cases, Jeffrey Sterling, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, John Kiriakou, only one person ever prosecuted did they believe had that level of intent. That was Joshua Schulte. We can debate whether or not he had that level of intent or not, but it just shows that would throw out the convictions of pretty much everyone who has had an Espionage Act prosecution brought against them. And I'll note at Chelsea Manning's court-martial, she was acquitted of aiding the enemy, which had a higher level intent, but found guilty of the Espionage Act. So we're raising what they have to prove. We would also permit the defendant to testify as to the purpose of the disclosures. Right now, whistleblowers are generally not allowed to explain why they did what they did. The reason is that there's no public interest defense in the Espionage Act, and therefore why you did was irrelevant. And I know Daniel Ellsberg was very upset. He testified and was ready to explain why he risked his freedom, why he risked his life to give the American people the truth about the Espionage Act, and the judge stopped him from doing so. And it makes sense from the government's perspective, right? Imagine you're on a jury, you get called for a jury, you're told about espionage. You think, oh, the guy gave information to the Chinese or the Russians or Al-Qaeda. And it's no. I witnessed unconstitutional surveillance, and I gave it to a reporter who won a Pulitzer Prize, and the courts ruled the surveillance unconstitutional. Most juries with that information are not going to convict the defendant, nor should they, although maybe in the Eastern District they might, but most normal juries. And then finally, creating that affirmative public interest defense. I would argue the specific intent requirement is a backdoor public interest defense, but also the affirmative one. So you can say, I was trying to alert about waste, fraud, and abuse. I was trying to alert about violations of the U.S. Constitution. I was trying to alert about violations of the rules of laws of war. And that is a defense. So this is an extremely important bill. It is the first serious proposal we've had to reform the Espionage Act since it became the law in 1917. And I believe we're going to have a way to take action. Yes, we have a way to take action. Please use that action tool to reach your member of Congress and tell them you are their constituent. You believe in the First Amendment. You do not believe patriotic public employees who are upholding their oath to the Constitution by alerting the American people about crimes should be prosecuted as spies. You don't think journalists should be prosecuted as spies. You don't think journalists should be surveilled for reporting on government crimes. Tell them that, and tell them to pass this law.
Well, I can't really top that urge to action, but Chips has spent a lot of time working with Representative Tlaib's office and coming up with all the various amendments to the Espionage Act that would really protect the First Amendment, protect press freedom, protect whistleblowers. And so we do urge people to take action to support the Daniel Ellsberg Act, to reform the Espionage Act. So go to that URL that's on the screen and let your legislators know what you think about the Espionage Act in its current form and urge them to support the reforms.